Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to our latest Silverchair Universe webinar. This is the Silverchair Universe presents Bibblio. My name is Stephanie Lovegrove. I am the marketing manager here at Silverchair. And we're excited to have with us today Mads Holman, the CEO and co-founder of Bibblio. Mads will be taking us through Bibblio's offerings. And before we get started, just wanted to do a quick few housekeeping notes. You're all muted, so if you have questions throughout the webinar or toward the end, please type in the chat box and we will go through those at the end. This is being recorded, so a link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards and will be available online later if you'd like to share it or rewatch anything. And finally, when the webinar is concluded, you'll get a brief survey. We would appreciate if you took a minute to fill that out just as we help to continue to develop the program and the webinars. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Mads. In 1 second.
Thank you, Stephanie.
No problem.
I hope everyone can hear me. Then I just need to figure out how I can share my screen. There it goes. I can do that now. And it looks like that might even be showing up.
Yeah.
So let me sort of take this away a little bit. I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Bibblio as a company and then do a little bit of a demo. I'll try to keep that at about half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. And then from there on, we can begin to take some questions and stuff. I hope we can have a bit of interaction going on. And also, if people do have burning questions, as Stephanie said, do drop them in, and we can even sort of take that in a bit during the session too, if there's something that you really don't think can wait. I can sort of keep my red thread anyway. So long story short, Bibblio is a content recommendation platform. We essentially help content owners, publishers, media companies to find the right content for the right person at the right time. That sounds pretty simple, but there's quite a lot going on the scenes. And part of that is what we essentially want to take you through today. So sort of without further ado, let's run through it. Now, this depends a little bit on scenarios, but one of the scenarios we see quite a lot is sort of publishers and media companies saying to us that actually now a lot of the traffic, be that journal articles or general articles on the web, a lot of the traffic comes through from search and from social media or social sharing. When it's reference content, it's typically more driven by search. When it's other content, blog content, etc., it might be driven more by social media. But it means that people basically bypass our front page and all of our lovely navigation, and they land straight onto a piece of content. And we kind of think of every interaction between a user and a content page as an opportunity to engage that user further. So that's really where recommendation comes in. It's about all of this real estate that kind of sits around the primary piece of content on that page that can, do various content suggestions to the user. It can be most recent content, popular content, related content. There's actually quite a lot of different ways to recommend content to people. Just to give kind of an example from a brand that perhaps most people know, someone like Netflix, when you open up your Netflix kind of home screen, there's about 125 different recommendation algorithms essentially trying to figure out what you should be presented with. So the sort of area of content personalization and content recommendation is pretty big business. If you look at all the sort of major tech players, Facebook's newsfeed is essentially a recommendation engine. YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, these companies are all investing very heavily into personalization and content recommendation, content filtering technologies. However, as content owners, this is not necessarily sort of at the heart of our business. And our approach as a company is more to essentially say there's all these sort of workhorse algorithms that most companies are going to need, but it actually makes very little sense, and there's very little differentiation in sort of going and building those on our own. They find the most relevant content, the recent content, the popular content. It's really more about how you mix those things together and how you make it look and feel on the page that's going to sort of set you apart. So that's the sort of philosophy behind Bibblio. It's really sort of plug and play recommendations. So the way we work, and I'll demo this in a second, is when we get a new piece of content in, we will do a deep sort of NLP, natural language processing of that content. We'll generate some different types of metadata. And that will essentially sort of create the first recommendation index. It will relate all the content to each other. And then we have these little sort of drag and drop modules that if it's a web-based application, you can just grab a JavaScript module and put that on the page. If it's within an app or any kind of other application, of course, that changes a little bit. But the principle, it's an API, and even our own modules are consuming our own API. So whether you'll get that results into one of our modules or into one of your own modules, that really doesn't matter. Now, just to give a quick example here, I'll kind of demo it a bit too later on, so we can play around a bit more. But maybe it's worth talking over here. So as I said, the first thing that happens when we get a piece of content in is we do a reading of that content, and we generate 3 different types of data. We generate keyword data and entity data, and we have our own kind of concept graph as well, which is a bit of sort of a general taxonomy. And then you can go and sort of build these modules and basically sort of drag that code into your page, and off you go. And the whole thing really shouldn't take more than minutes. And suddenly you've got a little module there appearing at the bottom. You can decide how that looks and feels, what data you want to show. And so from here on, it's just going to show a couple of different examples of how that might look like in different environments. We work all across sort of media, news, publishing, books, libraries. So this is OpenLearn, as an example, the largest open course platform in the UK. It's called Other Content You May Like. So just to give a couple of examples of environments to say that very often the end user will not even know that it's actually Bibblio that's running the recommendations. They will simply go to a site they like. Here's an example of one going down the right side. And it's got this little fold over effect on it, just to show a couple of the different things that you can do. So generally, there's kind of any recommendation relies on these 3 pillars. It's the content. So how does the content relate to each other? That's often referred to as content-based recommendation, clues in the title. It looks at 2 content items, see how related they are, and basically revolves a lot around accuracy, trying to find the most accurate, the most related results for what the user is currently looking at. That's extremely useful within things like reference, where you want to make sure that the user is exposed to the most accurate results without sort of optimizing for user behavior or personalization. You don't want the user to get a personal view of the world necessarily. You want them to actually know what's out there. So content-based recommendation is at the heart of Bibblio. We kind of started from that end because we care a lot about the quality of the recommendation. So we're not necessarily an engine that's built for just optimizing sort of a personalization engine. I sometimes call it the Kim Kardashian approach, to try to drive as many clicks as possible in these filter bubbles. We're not an ad-funded technology, so we don't have any particular interest in people just consuming as much as possible. We're more interested in the user achieving their goal and leaving feeling satisfied and more loyal to the platform, which also means we often work more with subscription sites and sort of higher value content than news. We're not particularly a news focused engine. We're more focused on books, vertical publishing, specialist publishing, all those kind of domains, education and learning. Then as soon as the modules go live, you can essentially, there's a set of algorithms for beginning to optimize behavior that can optimize towards engagement, but it can also optimize towards, say, conversion. So if one of the goals is, as an example, to get the user to put in their email and register or log in again, you can actually begin to optimize recommendations towards sort of deeper business goals like that, not just spending more time or interacting with more pieces of content. And finally, we do have a whole set of user-based sort of tools. So that the main difference there is that you would essentially sort of query the system with a user rather than a piece of content to get a set of results back. So that can be used for deriving, say, a personalized feed. So when the user's logged in, you can actually begin to serve a feed of content to that user, which is more specific to them as an individual. The approach we use to that is a bit more like Amazon's kind of other users who've liked this have also liked that. It actually doesn't rely on a bunch of information about the user, which in all these days with regulation coming in, etc., we think is a very good thing. But it basically just looks at the user's ID and then looks at all the different items that consumer has looked at and enjoyed, and essentially tries to find people who have looked at very similar things to that, but introduce them to things that, or have a very similar profile to them, but haven't looked at those items yet. The benefit of that approach is you're not necessarily trapping people into a filter bubble. You could still have a user group that actually has a wide range of interests. So it's more looking at trying to find similar users, not finding similar content. So basically, at the heart of Bibblio is kind of how these three things work together. And we can mix and match these algorithms in different ways to achieve different goals. We would normally always recommend people to have multiple modules onto their page. So, you know, here's recent content, here's popular content or content that's been referenced a lot. Here's content that's really related to what the user's reading about. You could actually easily think up a situation where you have 3 or 4 or 5 different recommendation widgets on a page that serves different types of user journeys. And we tend to find that those different modules cannibalize very little on each other. So a user who came and landed on a journal article and ultimately wanted to see what was new or what was popular is not going to be the same user who's going to click on the related item. It's simply that the mode of exploration is quite different. So to maximize engagement and user satisfaction, using multiple different recommendation logics is typically a much better way to go than to try to cram it all into the same module. As we kind of say, we're one of those companies, we prefer to let numbers do the talking. So across our network at the moment, 1 in 8 users who see one of our modules will engage with it, around 12%. Typically, we will lift engagement metrics with about 10%. So bounce rate, dwell time, pages per session, some of these kind of basic metrics for web engagement will all be significantly impacted by Bibblio. Of course, that depends a little bit on how advanced the setup was running before Bibblio. If it's a site that didn't really have any recommendation modules already, that uplift can be significantly larger. This is kind of assuming a standard tag-based recommendation, but without machine learning and machine optimization and semantic technology. And then actually, if it's more of a web-based system, what you typically find is that there is a pretty significant SEO benefit, because once the pages are actually doing better and driving more engagement, Google these days is really a behavioral engine too. They don't just look at keywords and links to determine search ranking. They also look very much at the engagement of that site. So if the site has a high bounce rate or users don't stay for very long, Google will tend to penalize that in the search rankings. So we actually typically see people getting somewhere between 8 and 15% increased traffic as well from Google search. And all in all, that typically means that it's quite easy for our clients to look at what they'll be spending with Bibblio in a month and look at what that extra engagement and traffic is actually making them, whether their business model is advertising based or subscription based. It's fairly straightforward to work that back to a positive ROI. So I thought at this point I would sort of jump into a little bit of a demo of the system. So just so you guys can sort of get a sense in real time of what that looks like and show a few different environments. And then I think it's worth maybe discussing a little bit more of various examples around the world of people who are doing recommendation. Also, I would say at this point, if there's any sort of particular systems that you guys are interested in, I've always dreamt of knowing how Facebook does recommendation, or how Netflix or Spotify or Apple is doing recommendation. More than happy, I much prefer an interactive session. So if any of you are sitting with things like that, feel free to kind of shoot that and we can take that in as part of the session here. But I just thought I would demonstrate. I found one of the ACS publications, Engineered and Environmental Controls of Microbial Denitrification in Established Bioretention Cells. I'm not super familiar with the subject myself, but I thought it was worth taking. We are doing a little bit of work with ACS at the moment. In this case, I'm just going to actually take from the abstract. In general, when it comes to journal articles, there's a bit of discussion between, and books in general, whether or not it's best to go with the actual abstract or whether to go with the full text. It depends a little bit on the quality of abstracts, but in most cases, an abstract will actually do exceptionally well because in a way it is already a synthesized version of the entire document. So it actually tends to do pretty well. And as you can see here, ACS have some related content at the moment. There tends to be like a few different ways that people are doing this. Either it's sort of based on the tags or the keywords or the authors, or it's based on an editorial workflow, so people choosing related content. Very, very rarely do we see scenarios where people are actually running sort of machine learning to optimize these results over time. So you can say if you take nothing away from today other than this, it's really that lots of these widgets on sites are now becoming more and more kind of performance driven by algorithms that optimize those things over time. And we as a company believe more in actually creating a quality recommendation for the user. So that was Bibblio's system reading this abstract in real time. And as you can see, we begin to generate a bunch of keywords here. We rank those keywords based on relevance. So essentially, as a first step, this actually changes tagging from being sort of a black and white thing. It either has the tag or it doesn't, to in our system, it has the tag with a certain weighting, with a certain relevance score. The clue's kind of in the color. Green is better than red, but you can see here there's actually quite a lot of terms here that it's 100% sure of belongs in the content. Then nitrification, bioretention, chemistry, environmental science, natural environment, environmental technology, biology, earth sciences, organisms, and natural materials. And then you can also see we generate quite a lot of data even from that small piece of text. We then do entity recognition as well. Strangely, at the moment, that's not actually ranked, but as you can see here, denitrification and denitrifying and bioretention is by far the highest ranking entities in this. This hooks directly into linked open data. So at this point, these are linked open data entities where you can go to Wikidata or any other linked open database and essentially query to get more information about these different entities. And then we have the concept graph here, which is a ranked graph. It's worth saying at this point, Bibblio is not sort of predominantly a metadata tagging technology. We don't actually charge for this. It's included as part of the product because we use the reading of the content to generate the recommendations. The one sort of downside, if you want, to that is we can't do, say, specific readings. So if you had an existing taxonomy and you wanted Bibblio to kind of read all the content and map it to that particular taxonomy, that's not a service that we can offer. It's also a service that I wouldn't necessarily recommend, or an exercise I wouldn't necessarily recommend people going on, simply for the fact that teaching a machine learning system, teaching a sort of natural language processing system to read a particular way, to map to a certain sort of taxonomy will always be a one-off project. You know, as soon as that taxonomy is changing, that project will change again. So we don't sort of offer to map all of this data to a specific taxonomy. However, if that content is already tagged up against the taxonomy, we basically support full schema.org. So essentially we support many different types of metadata that you can add alongside the content when you add it to Bibblio. So you can add all sorts of things that belongs in the creative work here. So essentially, who's the author, what are the category, the copyright holder, the creator, when it was done, what formats it's in. You can submit all of this data to Bibblio alongside each piece of content. And as you saw here on OpenLearn as an example, we can begin to actually display these different types of data. So they've given us one field of data saying this is an article and this is a piece of audio. As you can see, this particular piece of content, they also know how long it's expected to take. They know what category it belongs in, what's the title, the description. So it begins to give an idea of, you know, essentially you want to show the data in the recommendation that's going to make the user most likely to engage. So if you go over to this environment, of course, it makes sense to have things like the authors. You might even want to add sort of what journal it's from, etc. So think for each of your particular environments, what is the type of information that I need as a user in order to make an informed choice about whether I want to engage with this piece of content or not? That makes any sense. And then as soon as that's essentially done, as I said, you can go in here and basically sort of begin to build your own module. So these are all standard modules that you can basically take and drag and drop onto a site. If that's the way that you do it and the content is publicly available, you can actually just create the module and drop it onto a page. And then Bibblio's module will actually automatically go and read the page and add this to Bibblio. So this is an example from the Canadian Electronic Library. This, as you can see, is built by Bibblio, but actually we also run this little thing called show more related tiles. So if you do that, we actually kind of run a search query based on that particular book, and it gets you a set of results that you can engage with as a user. So that's just one sort of example of Bibblio. In this case, we show 20 results because we think that's a good sort of number of things to show the user. In this case, it can just about fit on a page. As I said, if you go to OpenLearn, Bibblio will look more like this, but there's essentially a ton of different environments and a ton of different Bibblio integrations. And most of the time, as I said, as a user, as an end user, you would never know that it's actually Bibblio powering that. We have lots of environments like a far big US travel website where it's not even our module. They've actually built the front end themselves, and they're just simply using Bibblio on the back end to inform what they want to show to the user. Two other quick things. There is two other things that I think are worth thinking about. One is how to effectively split the content. So one of the scenarios we see quite a lot as an example is that people have free content and paid for content. In that scenario, it might make a total sense to essentially create one module that is showing all the free content, whether that's article content or blog content, etc. And then essentially you have a secondary module which can show some of all the premium content. This is a great way for sort of monetizing that premium content, making sure that users can actually discover premium content in every environment. So we have a function called catalogs. It just allows people to essentially split their content into different buckets. And then you can simply tell the module when it recommends what catalog it's allowed, catalog or catalogs that it's allowed to pull content from to generate the recommendations. So it's very easy to create these different modules, you know, show me more from the same category versus show me more from the rest of the site. It can also, of course, send across sites. So actually, the thing we're working with ACS on is actually connecting all of their different journals together so that you could have a second module here that essentially shows you content from the other ACS journals. Because at the moment, there is no cross-discovery. And this kind of takes me back to my point of what Bibblio ultimately also is working towards. So at the moment, a lot of people on the internet really discover stuff through Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or things like that. But actually, we believe that a large part of that is because as soon as people land on a site around the web, they're kind of in this silo where they can't discover the rest of the web. And if you sort of think back to the original idea of the web with the HTML link, was sort of to allow the user to move seamlessly between environments. We are working as a company to essentially sort of reestablish this horizontal layer. So we allow publishers to essentially work together. As long as two publishers both have their content on Bibblio, they can essentially put a module onto the page and simply sort of point at the other person's catalog and actually recommend content from other publishers. Now, the way that's mostly being used today is to recommend between my own properties. So we run the gaming network as an example. They have 80 different sites within different PC games and console games or whatever. And they're using this to essentially sort of show users content from their other sites. Same with ACS within the reference. They have multiple different journals that overlap to varying degrees, but they're really interested in sort of helping the user discover their other journals. So the long-term play with this is to essentially sort of reduce publishing's reliance on things like Facebook and Google for traffic acquisition and begin to drive a pretty significant portion of the visitors that people get from direct visits or from sort of visits from other referrers. If you go back about 10 years, 80–85% of all visitors would typically come directly to a platform. Now that number is about 20–25%. So we've really seen, to no surprise in the last 5–10 years that these companies have sort of stepped in between the user and the content creators. We want to, and we think it's about time to sort of begin to revert that process again and giving publishers some tools for building more direct relationships with each other, but also the more direct relationships with users. So you could, of course, also use something like the personalized endpoint, so the user endpoint, to say begin to drive personalized newsletters or any of, you don't necessarily have to sit and wait for a user to actually come back to your platform. As soon as you have their email or you have an app on their phone, you can serve notifications and emails, making them aware that there might be content that they are interested in. So we also sort of work with clients who essentially take our API, but then build their own types of business rules or business systems on top of that. And the benefit here is, as a publisher or content owner, you don't have to sort of spend 18 months and a bunch of data scientists and developers to build the whole data pipeline and these core algorithms. You can actually go straight to the use case and say, okay, I want to call the system to generate some results, and then I want to prioritize the results based on these things. And you can essentially have a solution for something like personalization live in a matter of days instead of years. So that's kind of the core of Bibblio's technology. More than happy to sort of show a few other examples here. I also thought it was worth, so we're one of these companies, we're pretty transparent about the way that we price stuff. So you can actually go to our site and you can basically sort of scroll up and down and see what the different pricing would be. We obviously have for the more technical people, a full set of documentation. More than happy to share that. There's sort of live code examples here, so you can essentially go in and play with it directly, which is pretty cool. There's all the different things you can do with the module here or with the platform here. So I think that sort of covers the main bit. You can go on the technology here and sort of play around with that yourself, but actually also you can go and sign up a free account, and that actually gives you access to all of the tools I was demonstrating earlier. So as soon as you log into the platform, this is actually a client that's hit their storage limit, so that's quite interesting. But you'll be able to get this type of data. So we show you how many recommendations we've served, how many times the users actually saw the module, how many times it's been clicked, and that gives you the CTR percentages, etc. So that's kind of at the core of it, but then you also get access to the demos here, so you can go in and try the NLP technology for yourself. As soon as you start to add content to the system, it all appears in here, and you can go and sort of explore each piece of content and see what data we've generated. All of this metadata also becomes available via the API. So we essentially have two endpoints, one for retrieving metadata and one for retrieving recommendations. So that's kind of the core of the Bibblio platform. I would be very excited to hear if there's anyone who has any questions or anything that they would like to know more of the stuff that I went through in the last half an hour or so.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. It's great to see the actual platform at work. Don't have any questions come in yet. We'll just give another minute in case anyone wants to drop any in the chat box.
That's fine. I can keep talking in the meantime.
Sure, yeah.
So I think when it comes to the whole area of recommendation, it might sound really simple, but what we actually end up spending a lot of our time on is working together with partner sites to figure out how to show the recommendations to people what different modules should go on the page, how should they look and feel. And I would say from the different tests that we've done that actually the way the module looks and feels and the way it sits on the page matters as much for performance as the underlying algorithms. So it's very interesting that there really also is a kind of UX and experience element to this. I always say that at the end of the day, when a user, be that a researcher, a student, or a professor, has been to a platform and they've engaged with some content, no one actually leaves kind of going, do you know, I really loved the algorithm, but I didn't like the UX, and actually, you know, overall, I think it meant I had, you know, people are experienced. Either they felt like they had a good experience or they felt like they didn't. We don't, as human beings, actually kind of break that experience into its component parts. So I think it's very interesting to remember to always think about these things. I always advise to kind of start with what's going to meet the end user. You know, when people load up my page, one of my articles, one of my journal pieces, one of my books, what do I want them to see? So to give another example, we run a sort of smaller book platform here called Bibblio. And interestingly enough, of course, when you've clicked a book, you want to recommend other related books that the user might want to buy. Now, just to give a specific example here, the way we built the catalogs here is simply based on the same age bracket. So once you're clicking on a book, you will only ever be introduced to books that are appropriate for children of roughly the same age. And if you think about it from an end user point of view, that makes total sense. I don't want to be the mom or the dad of an 8-year-old landing on a book and essentially be recommended a bunch of teen fiction, even if it's related or relevant to this particular book's topic. So that's just one example of how you can use the catalog functions to make sure that you're recommending this. And you could even begin to imagine that actually they could have one module here, but then you could essentially sort of have an experience to the right, which would say, you know, go to books for older kids. And you could have one here going, you know, go slightly younger. And actually that could serve up a new set of recommendation results based on that other catalog. So it's very interesting of how you can also use these as kind of modules or components to build different types of user interaction. And we are firm believers in this whole area called human-computer interaction. I really believe that the future of these types of systems are systems that the end user can interact with. You know, if you go to a normal kind of Google page today, right? You will see that, let's just say I search for The Guardian here, and I find the search results. You actually have all these tools where you can say, well, I only want the last 24 hours, I only want videos. These are essentially ways for me as an end user to specify exactly what I was looking for. You know, I only want UK content. In a way, that whole sort of interaction in search, you know, if you go to a hotel booking or flight booking, you're very likely to have just, you know, let me show you an example from the one I use, Momondo. To the left here, you will have all these different search filters that you can apply, right, to help you. I'm actually going to New York next week, so that's it's remembered. But you can see here, I can define if I only want direct flights, I can decide when I want to take off and when I want to land. And all of these filters essentially help the search engine produce more relevant results. But there is nothing to stop a user from interacting with a recommendation algorithm in the same way. People like Facebook is beginning to do it a little bit, where you can sort of say, don't show me more of this stuff or show me more of that stuff. But we think that there's a whole world that can be opened up in terms of letting users say, well, actually, could you give me content that's more recent? Or I want content that has a high citation count. And actually, that interaction, there's some very compelling research showing that simply by having algorithmic transparency and letting the user sort of take the steering wheel, the user actually becomes more satisfied with the experience. So I would kind of say that as a sort of appeal at the end, we don't have enough clients at the moment who are really trying to take that to the next step. we unfortunately, most clients still get to the point where they sort of get these modules on the page and they're happy, and then they kind of leave it there. And we think that there is a next stage to go on where, as a user, you could say, I want to favorite that, or actually, I really didn't like that one. There could be a little X here that you could just click and it would show you a new recommendation instead. So at the moment, we're actually missing quite a lot of valuable user interaction data simply because we don't let the users tell us what they want. And if there's one thing that I've learned from these last 4 years of building Bibblio, is really that I know this might sort of make me an AI skeptic, but I don't think at this point that AI really truly understands people. I actually think if you look across Facebook and Netflix and all these companies who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this problem, it's mostly still pretty average. I had an interesting thing where, as an example, the Guardian is my newspaper in the UK. Their most read article in the first week of April was what to watch on Netflix and Amazon in April. So despite these companies spending hundreds of millions on recommendation engines, most people still apparently go to the Guardian to read a journalist's opinion about what they should watch, right? So I think that sort of tells us where we are. And without a doubt, these systems improve engagement metrics across the board. You can say it kind of makes a personal librarian that optimizes the results on every page to every user, which is something we can never achieve editorially. But as an example, we find it works extremely well to have a combination of modules. We're working on a project with a video on demand platform at the moment. And there we're actually going to have two modules. One is essentially chosen by our curators. And it's very clear that this is manual and that it's chosen by real people. And then underneath that is essentially the related content, which is done algorithmically. So I think it's also important to take away from this that we're not sort of advocates of making the whole world automated. But if you can have automated recommendations on all of your pages automatically, you actually also free up a lot more of the editorial team's time to make valuable collections for the user, to have timely events. So as an example, on the voice, video on demand platform, when it's Oscar season, you have the Oscar lists. When different things happen in the world, as an editorial team, you're freeing up time to essentially respond to those things and create very high value curation. I sometimes refer to it as the iceberg model, that really what users see, those 10% above water, that's still best done by humans. If we want to have, these are the 5 things we recommend on the front page, that's probably still best done by humans. Because humans are aware of all these things in the world that an algorithm is not necessarily aware of. Nelson Mandela has just died. The algorithm doesn't know that, but the humans do. But on the other end of the spectrum, someone like Bibblio, I think, has 60,000 books at the moment. To optimize what to show for every one of those 60,000 books can never be achieved with human resource. So that's kind of the two different ends of the spectrum, and hopefully that's something sort of valuable to take away, that I don't think we're particularly fans of just sort of turning the whole world into an algorithm, but there are particular things that an algorithm does very well at scale that frees up humans to do other things that humans actually do much better than algorithms.
And I imagine, are there opportunities, in custom tagging and things like that, where you can have sort of a middle ground where you surface certain tags to make it a slightly more curated set of recommendations?
Certainly. You can also build that into the user experience. I don't think I have any of the examples here that aren't behind kind of login or paywall. But as an example, you could take some of this Bibblio data that we generate and essentially sort of turn that, show that to the end user. So essentially, the second I have this data, as an example, let's say ACS decided to display all the tags that had a certainty of 1 underneath the content here. As soon as a user clicks on one of those tags, as an example, you could redirect them to a search result of all the content in the database that have the same tag with a certainty of 1, as an example. So yes, you can also build interaction around that. We also have a few people, I should say, who are beginning to use this data as part of the sort of editorial workflow. So because you can get that data back in real time, you could actually submit an article or a book or a description to the engine and get suggested keywords back. So it doesn't mean that we necessarily automate the tagging, but actually humans are much better at tagging if they're getting inspiration. I kind of jokingly say no person likes to sit and stare at a blank box and think about where to start. So actually showing some inspiration makes people better at tagging. So we, again, would often advocate that we as Bibblio will always hold a kind of clean version of this data based on our reading. But you can, of course, build that into a workflow where the user then adds kind of human tags, and that gets stored in a different metadata field. And you could then display that data inside of the recommendations, as an example. We have one other sort of use case at the moment with a self-publishing platform, where when the end user uploads the book to the platform, they will actually see which books it's going to be related to. So they can sort of change their tagging and stuff based on the books that this book is going to be associated with on the platform. And they can, of course, look at what tags those authors have used for their books, etc. So more as a kind of inspiration engine, not actually a recommendation engine. So I think it's also interesting to think about it as part of a sort of workflow for humans. And again, I would say it's an area where I don't think people have necessarily done enough to take advantage of some of the technologies that are now available.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. I haven't seen any other questions come in. I think we've covered a lot of ground. If there's anything else you'd like to add, otherwise we can kind of wrap up.
Last chance.
All right. Well, and if anyone does have questions after the fact, you can feel free. Mads, I don't know if you'd prefer people get in touch with you, or if there's another way you'd like people to get in touch with Bibblio. You
can certainly do. I'm hopefully pretty easy to find on the internet, but otherwise it's Mads at bibblio.org, double B. That will go straight through to me. Otherwise, there should be lots of different forms across our site that should make it hopefully pretty easy to get in touch with us. Great. So any of these different forms, fill out and submit, and someone will pick that up pretty quickly.
Oh, sure. And likewise, feel free, Silverchair clients, to reach out to your PDM. If they can always start conversations as well and get some of that going if you'd like to talk about integrations or options or timelines. But yeah, otherwise, thank you very much, Mads, for joining us today. Like I said, this will be available online shortly if anyone would like to rewatch or share. And please watch your release notes emails for future webinars and more information about Bibblio. Thanks very much, Mads.
Thank you.
All right,
cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.